When, as an old woman, Osrith looked back at her time in Mercia, it was this time that she remembered, humiliated and driven from Wessex, sent to the territory that King Alfred sought to dominate under the guise of helping it against the Danes. Cleaving it in two was a master stroke, Osrith often thought. How could a potential king, and there were many families of the line of Icel still living in the kingdom, ever seek to gain primacy when the king of the West Saxons had given half away? Miral was one such man, although he had never said aloud in Osrith's hearing that he was of the same family as the great king, Piber of the Icklingers. Instead, she had found it out inadvertently after overhearing a potentially sensitive conversation between Ethelred and Aldhelm, in which the Lord of Mercia had disclosed his policy of displacing potential rivals to his lordship through land disputes, sometimes over very trivial things. But that was in the future. Now, Osrith was walking her anger off as she neared the great Mercian capital of Aylesbury, just north of that famous battleground of Ashington, and the other, Reading, both Wessex victories, which had stemmed the tide of Danes into the kingdom. It took 3 days to get to Aylesbury. Osrith had made the mistake of walking directly north, along a drover's road, and had to bear east. The chalk hills were rounded and undulating, and she stopped at Alton for a bed. There was an inn with stables and she paid to sleep above them, before moving on to Reading. At that town, Osrith stopped at a house of a Brewster, a female ale-maker, and she imbibed a weak glass of the woman's trade, though against her better judgment, and wondered that night, with the rye and barley ferment drifting to the room she had rented for the night, whether there were any Britons in Aylesbury. She had seen none on her way up, although Osrith knew that Britons, especially those trading in herbs, were discreet enough to be invisible. But her bleeding was coming back and she had had to pack herself with leaves before she left Reading, and had used all of the last of the lily root that she had bought from Ulla. And it was at Risersburg that Osrith caught up with someone she knew. Walking beside his wife, her friend Elfrith was on his way to Aylesbury, too. It was only when she saw his unmistakable form, and saw his slightly built wife beside him, that Osrith realized how quickly she had covered the miles between there and Winchester, and she called to him as they reached Ridgedown, which, Osrith expected, would be a wide expanse of lower ground on which Aylesbury could be seen. "Ethel, this is Osrith," an astounded Elfrith told his very smiley wife, who curtsied to Osrith, to her amusement, and her anger softened now that she was in the company of her former comrade. "Your hair is long, you are a woman?" Ethel asked, putting her hand up in the direction of Osrith's hair. She had worn it down for most of the journey, where normally it would be bound in leather, and it had grown past her ears, and Osrith had needed hawthorn twigs to keep it out of her eyes. "You have a fine jewel," the little woman added. An image of the man who had gifted her the fine jewel had appeared in Osrith's mind as she said how pleased she was to meet Ethel, but passed no comment about Eric Thurgilson. He had slid it into her hair after braiding it, and warned her that, if loose, it could be her end. That was before the battle before Dunnottar, where Griocgair, Giric, allied to Eochaid, had attacked Domhnall with the king of Strathclyde's own Cymric troops, before she had left the Norse and the truce had ended. Where was he now, she thought as she, Elfrith and Ethel walked northeast. Eric had mentioned Wessex to her. Osrith thought, he had almost said as much about an invasion. It had been said that the Thurgilson brothers were in Lundin, so presumably he and Siegfried had left or been expelled from Alba, but had enough ambition to consider their next move to be Wessex. To attack East Anglia, Guthrum, now King Aethelstan, must have not opposed them, and Osrith felt a kind of satisfaction that the Norse warrior who had taught her his language when they had been in captivity in Caerleaguilid nearly a year before was now fulfilling his ambitions. "So, you are to be a warrior for Lord Ethelred?" Elfrith asked. "Why?" he pressed. His wife nudged him into silence. He gave her a silent shrug and mouthed, "What?" "A warrior," Osrith agreed, the earth damp underfoot as the last league of their journey was before them, a slightly damp lowland which rose to the town ahead. A warrior. Though Stipa had given letter to her for Miral, Osrith still felt apprehensive. No matter Alfred's fine words, to her, she had failed in Wessex. As Elfrith's words, and Ethel's replies washed over her. Osrith's mind turned to her brother. Why could she not tell Uhtred? She had imagined it so many times since she had seen him that day, angry, frightened and defiant before the gates of Bibbenberg, when he came to bring his own threat to their uncle, Ælfric. It had been ... not as she thought. Osrith had imagined him smiling and saying welcome. But she had imagined no more than that. Yet she had found out a great deal about him. A wife pushed aside his firstborn son, died his paganism with his new wife, technically Osrith's sister-in-law, for records of a marriage between her and Gisla's brother Guthred existed. Uhtred had been enslaved by Danes, had a hatred and ultimately allowed his foster brother Ragnar kill Kjartan and recover Dunham, had garnered reputation by fighting for Alfred and Wessex. Uhtred had collected men as one might collect silver, and he had plenty of that, too, who were, unlike that precious metal, loyal and loved him. Even a young monk had begged to serve him. In Osrith's experience, warriors generally wished to become monks, rather than the other way around. And Uhtred had a new family now, a woman he openly showed his love for, 2 young children, an estate close to the Thames River. Who was he, really? Osrith knew so much about her brother, but she did not know him. As the midday sun picked the carpet of green grass out before them, and Ethel pointed at the path that would take them to Aylesbury, Osrith concluded that it didn't matter now. She was gone from Wessex, and she could just be someone Uhtred had once known, fleetingly, briefly. Now, with her letter, dictated by Alfred on recycled parchment to one of his scribes, she was being recommended to Mercia. But Osrith's one regret was that she had been so close to telling Bicca that she was there, alive. A warrior. Why had she held back? She mourned this opportunity now in her chest, sitting as it did like a tight knot of discomfort. This, after he had been so kind to her when she was a child. If they were ever to meet, Osrith thought, she would, tell him. Ælfrith had gone into the back of palace at Aylesbury, but Osrith waited at the front gates. When a guard, with a dreadfully rusty spear, had come down to speak to her and ascertain she was to speak to the head of the household guard, it had taken him a full hand's width of sun's passage, almost an hour, to return. This, as well as the fact that he had left the gate unbolted, had not endeared Osrith to the man. But, eventually, Osrith was taken before Lord Aldhelm in the armory, who read her recommendation out to her in front of Miral. Tall, thin, pointed face with a short beard, Aldhelm wore his hair cut short in the Saxon style. He peered at the letter once he had finished reading it and back to Osrith. Miral, can you see the obvious mistake? Osrith looked at her former commander. It was so odd to see him at ease, especially here, in Aylesbury. In Oddersgard, his bitterness exuded every pore, but the minute he knew he was heading back to his home, the veneer was discarded and a happy man stepped forth, like a butterfly from a caterpillar's cocoon. No, my Lord Aldhelm. Miral smiled at Osrith. She is everything that I remember her to be in Wessex. At the unexpected pronoun, Aldhelm raised an eyebrow, then held the letter back out to Osrith. The mistake is that this is so perfect that there is something wrong. He examined Osrith's face, as if it would tell him the answer. But instead, she spoke it to him. What is wrong, Lord Aldhelm, is that I am female, she told him. It was an embarrassment to the King of Wessex that he had appointed me his son's guard. He appointed you Edward's guard. Aldhelm seemed intrigued, and glanced at Miral for confirmation. Otter's former general nodded. Anything else? I guarded him and I trained him, Osrith replied. Miral. Aldhelm looked at his general. May we hear from you? The tall, stocky man took a step forward. Lord, Miral began, and Osrith saw a fleeting look that passed between them. Hadn't Miral had lands confiscated? Had he not once been a lord himself? Was he now in deference to a man who was once his equal? He seemed to tense and an expression of old passed over his features as Miral turned his full force on Osrith, and she felt her muscles stiffen as the old bitterness of her captain's manner rose in him as he bent his head to her. Are you so ashamed of your actions, Osrith Lackland? Miral yelled in her face, that you will not share your exemplary record in Wessex. Then he turned to Aldhelm and, to Osrith's embarrassment, listed everything she had done since arriving in Wessex, From her heroics in defending the Lord Order, to her guard duties in Devonshire and Wessex and guarding Mildreth, to defending the Etheling when she thought he was being attacked, training new guards, advising other guards, being able to rub along with anyone. And, throughout his enthusiastic ebullient lauding of her triumphs, still all Osric could think about her failure to be able to keep Ethelwold from her, which had ended her time with Edward. She glanced at Miral, who was still proclaiming her virtues. Without regard to her own personal safety, she set about rescuing a drowning boy which was believed to be Prince Edward. It was there that Miral stopped, taking a step back from Osric and folded his arms, looking triumphant. It helped him too, Osric figured, that her deeds were done under his command. Yet, by the look on her former general's face, pride was playing on his features. He was proud of what Osric had achieved. It would be a long time until Osric had unpicked why it was she was so ashamed of them. Indeed. Aldhelm looked at her, curiously. And you are Lackland? A mercenary? He pressed. I was a mercenary, Osric admitted, conscious of her Anglish-Gaelish accent in contrast with his rounded, Southern Saxon one. I was trained in the north, my lord, and I lost one another. I endeavoured to earn enough to return to him. And when I couldn't, I sought my family who, I was told, were in Wessex. Aldhelm was nodding his head. Well, it would seem you arrived in a good kingdom in which to earn wealth, though not the best kingdom. Such partings are a feature of the times in which we live, unfortunately. And you are a woman? Aldhelm did not look in the direction of Osric's chest, which is what usually happened. He kept his eyes on her face. I am a warrior, Osric replied. I could have returned to my lord if I had wanted, but I respect my lord Miral. She glanced at him, who had begun to blush ever so slightly, around the temples, who has extolled the virtues of this ancient of kingdoms. It has long fought my own kingdom, in ancient days. You are of Strathclyde, Northumbria born. See Hughes's, she confirmed, remembering her own fictitious tale she had given to Sainid to give to King when Constantine had consented to be parted from her side that day. My father was a fisherman, Osric went on, the old lie spilling out to prevent any measure of the truth. My mother told me of Oswald and Penda, and Edwin and Offa. She named me after King Oswy's daughter, Osric added, and she told me of the Queen Quentrith, Offa's wife, who fought many times beside her husband. When I was old enough I thought, if it is good enough for the Welsh wife of a mercen king, it would be good enough for me. Osric was aware, as she closed her mouth, that Aldhelm had taken a step back, and was sizing her up. If you are as reliable and brave as Miral tells me, as Efka has told me, then your sex is of no object. Aldhelm dipped his long neck so his face was close to Osric. And the names of your kin? The family of Osbert. My kin are cousins. My father and mother, and brother died before King's Palace while we were travelling to Iona. I heard a cousin was in Wessex, and a brother. And you did not find your brother? Aldhelm looked genuinely concerned. Osric dipped her head to the flagstones. She hadn't not the brother she sought, in any case. I did not. I thought I had many times, but each time, that man was not him. I am sure God will unite me with him, if that is his will. It was a success. Admission that you were yielding to the will of God nearly always worked. But Aldhelm pressed on. Your saint? He queried. Comsil. Do you know of him? Aldhelm gave a nod, and folded his arms over his leather jerkin. The founding saint of Iona, whose lead King Oswald took to found Lindisfarne. He buried men alive at the consecration of Iona. Did you know this? A pagan move? Osric looked genuinely shocked. Comsil was next to God to the Irian and Gaels. Did they know of this atrocity? I did not know, Osric replied, probably the first honest thing she had said to Aldhelm so far. Comsil is my saint, as he is the saint of my former king. Time on Iona drew me closer to his mission of converting the Picts, and then when Oswald converted the Bernicians, I feel the bastards had no choice. They raid Bernicia hard, she confided, have always raided, before the Danes came, so my father told me. Like the Cymry on our western border, Aldhelm mused, grimly, and the Danes in our beloved East Anglia. He nodded at Osric. Good. I must see you fight." Of course, Aldhelm probably meant, in due time, but Osrith had withdrawn Bué within a second and was challenging Miral. Miral grinned, and took up his own sword. And they were off, parrying and thrusting, ducking and avoiding blows. Osrith was not getting it all her own way. She was tired from walking, she figured, but managed to dodge 2 downward strokes which, under normal battle circumstances, would be killers. Instead, she went for Miral's legs and brought him down that way, at least taking an advantage over those 2 blows which were so easy. She was a fool to have been caught out by them. When Miral laid his sword to one side, Osrith stepped towards him, mimicking a death thrust to his stomach, before wheeling her blade away and offering him his hand. Miral was grinning, and she was sure then that her skill was indeed reflecting well on him. Over towards Aldhelm, the head of the guard was nodding in satisfaction. "Just one more thing," Aldhelm asked, as Osrith resheathed Bué and tagged Seeks. "In Wessex, what truly happened that Alfred has sent you to us?" Osrith exhaled, and not from the exertion. She had already told him that, so, by asking again, Aldhelm disbelieved her. She began to open her mouth, and give the only answer that she could. King Alfred was embarrassed. We Mersons knew she was female and the West Saxons did not. It was Miral who had answered for her, and he grinned at Osrith again. "I am glad you have come back a happier man, Miral," replied Aldhelm, turning to his general, then smiled warmly at Osrith himself. "As a captain, you will be presented by Miral to Lord Ethliad, and, once he has granted your accession to the army, you will have your own brigade to teach and to command." Osrith felt her mouth fall open. Her own men? That was more than she could ever have hoped. Youngsters, no doubt, Osrith, but it didn't matter. She would be paid more, for that too. She followed Aldhelm, who was showing her down a long passage from the armory. Unlike the palace at Winchester, Aylesbury's palace was made of timber and was dimly lit with dull torches. Presumably, any more intense risked the structure to fire. "We are a gelded land, with half of it invaded by Northmen," Aldhelm continued as he led Osrith and Merwal down another passage, after a right turn, "and most of our daily duties are guarding parties on the border to protect the towns and villages. I trust this is not too humble for such a famous soldier, defender of lords and princes." Osrith was about to protest at Lord Aldhelm's presumption, but she saw a twinkle of mirth in his eye. "Indeed not," Osrith replied, honestly. "Good." He pointed to a large room where many men were sitting around long wooden benches. At the sight of Aldhelm, they kicked themselves away, and stood up, food and tankards still in hands, which were promptly dumped down. He gestured towards a mezzanine level, presumably the sleeping arrangements. Aldhelm hovered by the doorway and looked back to Osrith. "And I hope the army of Lord Ethliad is enough to keep you from your old lord, and we provide you with a purpose. Now, follow me. Miral is going to introduce you to your brigade. You are to train them, manage them, treat them fairly and with compassion, be firm with them." Wow, thought Osrith, as she followed Aldhelm, her own men. But, too, Aldhelm had nearly called Ethliad Utad's cousin through his mother, King. Clearly the leader of Mercia had ambition of his own, though a bulwark against the unionism ambition of his father-in-law. Miral stood before the men and called them forward to their new captain. To Osrith's astonishment, while there were 3 younger men, 2 were clearly experienced fighters, older than Osrith, one big and broad like Steeper, another wiry and tall, like a tall version of Sainid. "Your captain, Osrith," Miral introduced. "She is experienced both in battle and in service." "She?" one of the older ones asked. There was a ripple, not unlike hastily subdued laughter, and Miral's turned to that of a heavy thunderstorm. But before Aldhelm or Miral could say anything, Osrith stepped forward, feeling her muscles ripple, feeling the centuries of her royal line support her, make her bold. "Yes, a woman. Now, I will ask you Ivar the Boneless, Ivar Loethbroek. You have heard of him?" The men's faces told Osrith so, though none of them spoke of it. Ivar had sailed down the Trent to Repton and scores of Danes had flooded Mercia. "In my first battle," Osrith nodded, acknowledging their assertion. So, at my first battle, I stood beside my lord as he killed Ivar the Boneless before his palace. I drove 2 Norsemen away from him as he slayed the Touchdeen, Osrith declared, beginning to pace before her would-be men. Before that, I hid, then rescued the prince, the heir to the throne, from slaughter. We fought the Norse in Irian and killed 17, I won my bet with my friend the prince that day, that I would slay more than him. She took her eyes past the man who had laughed at her. All the other men looked at her, then averted their eyes. It was I who got to Wessex, to earn silver, to work here, with this man, your commander. Osrith opened wide her arm towards Miral, and continued to pace, confidently. My first act was to save his master, the Lord Odda, from thieves. I was proud to serve under the Lord Miral, your lord, from whose conduct in Wessex, as representative of your beloved kingdom. Did you all proud? She smiled at Miral. It has been one of the greatest honors of my life to have worked with this man. He is why I come to Mercia for work, because I choose to, not because I had no choice. And I promise you all, I will serve Mercia as if it were my own land. Murmuring through the men, and 1 or 2 cheers, stifled a little too late. Miral stood beside Osrith, and the men settled down. And if anyone wishes to test your new captain, who has fought so valiantly, came a voice from within the throng of men, then it is likely she will pull your guts out of your ass before you have even drawn your sword. Whoever was speaking was pushing his way forward, and he continued, if it had not been a training demonstration, King Alfred's head guard would have been in his grave, of that I am certain. Steepa Snotna, someone called, and the ripple of his name ran through the men again. Yes, Osrith replied, to herself. She knew reputation was important. But, at that moment, with war murmurings and unrest, what she wanted to do was prove herself, kneel to a new lord, earn their trust, not brag of her past. She was only as good as her next fight. You have your men, 5 of Mercia's best, Miral claimed. But the man who had called out in Osrith's support had got his way to the front. 6. It was Elfgar. Osrith's chest felt lighter as one of her closest comrades proposed the number. If you wish it, he added, smiling at Osrith. But Osrith shook her head. No, she protested, then turned to Miral. If it pleases you, Lord Miral, she added quickly, Elfgar should not be of my men. He should be deputy. At this, Miral smiled, almost as broad a smile as his cousin. Elfgar was pleased to gain a promotion at Osrith's word. Aldhelm stood by the door with Miral, who called her over, and they escorted her from the room. 88,888,888. 2 across the courtyard. Early autumn sun lay a golden path across the courtyard as 2 of Aldhelm's men moved aside their spears for them. Though their eyes were fixed ahead, Osrith got the impression they wanted to look at her, so she kept her own eyes fixed ahead. A fire blazed in a pit in the center of the hall, funneled very cleverly by metal, so the smoke channeled up into the ceiling and through a hole in the thatch. So the hall was clear of obscurity, and there was no mistaking the gold and green-robed lord sitting on his throne. He sat, looking intrigued at her, but mainly looking as if he was bored of having been dragged away from a feast or pastime. On his curly, blonde hair was beset a circlet of bronze. Not a crown, it was not supposed to be. And yet, it looked for all the world like a diminutive form of the crown, with the lys flowers curling every so often around its brim, encrusted with emeralds. Alfred's crown. To Osrith, it was clear what Lord Ethelred was trying to convey. Beside him sat Ethelfled, his bride, who had departed Winchester nearly 2 months before. Osrith was appalled. She had never liked the woman, and recalled the nasty things she had done to her younger brother. But no woman should be treated like Ethelfled had been treated. Her face was bruised, and she looked as if she had lost a lot of weight. Clothes Osrith recognized as being Ethelfled's before she left Wessex were hanging off her. My lord, Osrith bowed, and Ethelred nodded his head. Lady, she added, and Osrith felt her stomach lurch. Ethelfled struggled to meet her gaze. That arrogant, spoiled princess was gone and had been replaced by a woman where all of the spirit had been taken from her. But meet her gaze she eventually did, and Osrith nodded her head to Ethelfled, whose cold, brown eyes fixed on her. "My lord," Aldhelm introduced, "King Alfred has sent this warrior on recommendation. As such, I have read the letter he has written and promoted Osrith to a captaincy, with our very own Elfgar as deputy." Ethelred looked from Aldhelm to Osrith, his eyes narrowing. "The servant," he observed, "come to bring us wine?" Aldhelm said nothing for a moment, but Miral stepped forward. "Osrith's bravery in the face of adversity," he began, and listed her feats. Osrith, meanwhile, thought about her king, to whom she had given her word. She had sworn to Domhnall, given him her oath. But, was it still a valid oath if her king had broken it? Osrith reasoned not, for it was the king of Alba who had broken faith with her. "Your name is familiar," Ethelred said, when Miral had stepped back. He leaned forward in the Mercian throne and peered at her. "We had a queen Osrith in this land, once." "King Oswy of Northumbria was Osrith's father," Osrith clarified. "My mother oft told me the story," she added, which was true. "Osrith, daughter of Oswy, she recovered her uncle's body, Saint Oswald, and had him interred at Bardney in the ancient kingdom of Lindsey." Ethelred mused, then looked at Osrith again. "You know a great deal of Mercian history." Osrith bowed her head. "It is my history too. Every Berknishan knows Saint Oswald." But Ethelred looked bored and seemed to go through the short ceremony of Ulgens quickly, where Osrith knelt before him and swore Ulgens to Ethelred and his land Mercia, calling for wine the second that Osrith had got back to her feet. Aldhelm and Miral ushered Osrith quickly from the throne room, and Aldhelm, dressed in the same green and gold as his lord, ushered her back through to the military hall. "Are you ready to meet your men?" 88,888,888. Miral's hurry to accept Osrith was not altogether down to her known ability as a swordsman. Alfred was sending troops to liberate Lundin from the pagans, two brothers, the Thurgilsons, and when Osrith discovered this, and discovered, too, that Miral had placed enough trust in her to lead a small band of warriors, the gravity of the situation began to weigh on her. Osrith was trusted enough to lead men she did not know. Before Miral introduced them to her, he had told her that, should she be harassed, as she had been harassed by Ethelwold in Winchester, she must simply speak to him. No quarter was to be given to any man trying to press his advantage, and Miral even went on to tell Osrith that, was there not the urgency to train in preparation for a successful attack, he would have given her leave to deal with any potential harassment herself. Miral, was this really him, who 6 months ago had called her barbarous Scottish scum? Was it really him who extolled her virtues to Lord Aldhelm, Lord Ethelred's general? So Osrith followed Miral and Aldhelm back to their warriors' hall and stood before them, as Miral addressed the men, who stood before their general, silently eyeing Osrith. "This captain, under whom 5 of you are to be trained and run in battle, can make the enemy tremble before even a blade had been whetted." Miral began. "How?" One of the older men nearer the front, humor playing insolently at the corners of his mouth. "You will see, Leofstan," Miral told him, as Elfgar grinned. He knew Osrith's blood-curdling screaming yell, that of the Gaels in battle. Osrith was not even aware she did it, until it was pointed out by Ethelflaed when she nearly beat Steeper in the battle demonstration. It had been King Alfred who had then said the battle scream had been effective, and that, more than anything, was the best thing the King of Wessex had ever said to her. "Leofstan," Miral added, calling the man out of the group. "You are to be one." He searched the faces, and called out a similarly older man, Falkburg, and 2 very young men, only just out of boyhood. One dark-haired, Oshir, and the other fair, Egelwulf. From the back a diminutively built boy, who later Osrith discovered to be just a little younger than her, at 14, Elfkin, joined the other 4. They were her men. She was to command them, train them, have them put their trust in an unknown warrior new to their kingdom and certainly not a Mercian. Osrith knew she had to prove herself, to begin the line of trust, and she nodded to each one in turn, evening sunlight glinting off Buey as she pulled her blade from her scabbard. Not just her 5. All of the men of Ethelred's army watched her, as she stood before her men. "I will take you under my command," Osrith said, as if the choice of each man had been her and her boots trod over the straw, and she went to each man in turn and offered to fight him. Leofstan, her challenger, and Oshir stood still and said nothing. Beside them, Elfkin drew a sharp sword, perhaps a seek's, which looked full-sized on the boy. Osrith bowed her head as Elfkin approached her, bringing the whole length of buoy over her shoulder and out in front of her. The boy's eyes widened, but he did not drop his own blade, and began to strike out at her in short, sporadic lunges from a distance far too far for anything to possibly harm Osrith. Osrith kept the boy swinging, quickly and with agility aligned with his age, until he was tired, standing silently before him, and then attacked. Under the possible seeks she jabbed her blade, using buoy as a lever as she turned towards him. The men watched as the seeks whirled away from Elfkin, who scuttled back towards Oshir. Osrith saw the familial features at once, and smiled kindly at Elfkin, retrieving his sword, which had tumbled towards the door of the small hall, and handed it back to him. The boy said nothing, but stared at her with wide, chestnut eyes. Falkberg met her challenge next, and when Osrith had buoy at his throat conceded.